beyond. Welcome to Pew and Beyond. It's Tuesday afternoon, and that means it's time for us to have our conversation once again together. And we're very pleased to be welcoming Ian Mobsby from the Diocese of Southwark, correct?
Correct.
In the Church of England. Ian is an author and speaker and practitioner of fresh expressions and emerging church and new monasticism and contemplative prayer. And we're very excited to be having this conversation today. So welcome, Ian.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
My name is Neil Mancor, and I am the Congregational Development Coordinator for the Diocese of Montreal. And I am here with my colleague.
I'm Lisa Vaughn, the Parish Vitality Coordinator for the Diocese of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. And as we begin today, we would like to acknowledge that we share this land with the peoples who came before us, our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We continue to work for healing and reconciliation, and we are mindful of the stewardship of the earth, this God's creation. And just a reminder about Pew and Beyond, it is an initiative of the Spiritual Formation for Discipleship Network of the Anglican Church of Canada. We do have a Facebook page. You may join us there. Welcome, Ian, from across the pond. It's a delight to have you here. You don't have any beer today. In photo, you have beer, so next time.
Don't tempt me, don't tempt me.
Just want to say hi to Valerie and Susan Robertson and Michelle Schofield Bulls here and Linda Cass-Jones and Martha Whitaker. So we're starting to spread out. As always, to our guests, we welcome you to come and say hello. Check in the comment section. Tell us where you're from and where you're coming in from. The more that you comment, the more the conversation gets spread all around and the bigger the conversation will be. And we certainly do welcome your comments and questions and ideas, anything that gets inspired in you by what Ian has to talk about today or we talk about, we'd love to hear from you. So do join the conversation. And as I said, it makes the conversation just so much bigger. Andrew is here and Peter Misoschek is here. So welcome to you all. So Ian, we're just thrilled that you could be with us today. We're really excited about this conversation. And I wanted to make a start. Tell us a bit about what you're doing, the main things that you're doing and who you are, because you're doing some work as well for Canada too. So we'd love to hear kind of a bit about a roundup of what you do.
Okay, so one hat is I am a pioneer minister in a parish that has kind of died in central London, just south of Blackfriars Bridge. So I am here trying to galvanize a parish through planting a new monastic community, and also to try and engage with the spiritual, not religious, to do mission. So that's the other job. I have a hat. I'm the Assistant Dean for Fresh Expressions and Pioneering for the Anglican Diocese of Southwark, which is the diocese for South London. Those two. I'm also the guardian of the Society of Holy Trinity, which is a kind of a fraternity of people who are trying to plant missional new monastic communities. And in Canada, I was very excited to be made the canon for mission theology for the Diocese of Niagara. So that's been a joy, and of which I'm currently teaching a course on new monasticism over Zoom. So that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment.
Wonderful.
And of course, you're the co-author of the book. Well, there's several books that we're looking at, but one of them is Ancient Faith, Future Mission. Also God Unknown. And that's focusing on Trinity, spirituality, and mission.
Yeah.
So, I mean, part of what you've been doing is being involved with the Fresh Expressions movement. And a lot of us have heard about that. But in Canada, it's certainly present. So we have a Fresh Expressions Canada website. But we haven't all been sort of brushed up on where it's at now. Maybe could you just sort of begin by telling us a bit about just the Fresh Expressions movement and kind of what's now happening?
Great, thanks, Neil. So Fresh Expressions started off as an initiative in the UK originally in the context of the Archbishop Rowan Williams working with Graham Cray, and a real sense of coming together about trying to address the unchurched and the de-churched. So it became a really central thing, which quickly became an ecumenical collaboration. And I think in time, and that's over 20 years ago now. So it's like in time that's built into a real focus on becoming a movement, and a movement very committed to contextual mission. I think there's two things happening in the Church of England. One is the whole kind of church planting movement with places like HTB and churches very focused on renewal through sending people to kind of bolster up existing churches. Well, the Fresh Expressions movement has been thinking, well, how do we attend to the edge of where church meets culture? And I think particularly focused on the unchurched, and how do we build up relationships with that beautiful vision, which I really hold on to, about building ecclesial communities out of contextual mission, which is not easy. And there's loads of different, so there's all sorts of new forms, messy church being one of them, new monasticism being another. There's almost infinite different forms now of Fresh Expressions as part of a kind of a movement of kind of pioneers or missioners trying to attend to what God is doing in terms of the kingdom. So I'm excited. It's not so central to the Church of England in terms of being driven by an initiative, but I think it is definitely in the DNA of the Church of England, stronger in some dioceses than other, but very much a sense of trying to get on with that call to radical mission in context.
And you're involved here, and someone, Michelle's asking, is the course in new monasticism only for Niagara people, or can other people opt in? I know you're working for the Diocese of Niagara, so
that one is, I think, is started, but there are other ones that we're doing it over Zoom. So we're doing one for Australia and New Zealand, and there's one happening in various places. So it's not just for Niagara, but we're doing one particularly. They've got a new, I think they've got a new centre for missional leadership, and I'm teaching that as part of that there. But no, it's available in different forms. It's like a 5-week course. And there's different forms of that on Zoom. So you should, if you look up Facebook and look up my name, you should be able to find it.
I'm going to ask a question just for those who may have joined us today who don't know, and may not be familiar with the term new monasticism. What is that, Ian?
Well, first thing to say, it's the most terrible title there is, because it tends to make monastics think it's kind of monastic light. But basically, it's, I think, a way of being, a particular way of understanding what it means to be a Christian, a particular form of discipleship, which is inspired by the monastics and by the, things like the mendicants and Franciscans, with a real focus on contemplative action or prayerful action, where people commit to a rhythm of life, a daily rhythm of life, of prayer and action, so that sense of going much deeper with the Christian faith, and particularly in terms of Christian spirituality, and therefore that trying to then, through that, play a role in being a missional community. So it began with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, famously, who set up the first sort of new monastic communities in resistance to the Third Reich. And I think it's been going on ever since that. And we know the monastic tradition, or the religious life, goes right back to the very early Desert Mothers and Fathers, which has always been a radical missional movement in the wider church. So it's part of that, I would say.
So it's not just about a bunch of folks who are ascetics praying. There's action connected to, and there's a real missional edge, obviously, in terms of serving the community around them.
Totally. I think one of the really great strengths of that model is it's trying to open up Christianity in a way that kind of feels radically lived. And that, so sometimes you get forms of ecclesial community, which is all action, and then it burns out because there's not enough prayer and contemplation. Or you get forms of contemplation that are utterly removed from the world and a bit elitist and a bit withdrawn, where actually it does require some action. So I love that idea of prayer and action. Mm-hmm. The other really key thing about it is trying to really hold on to the new commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and body, and love your neighbor as yourself. Or as the Benedictine once said, learning to receive the love of God, to learn to love ourselves, to be able to love others. And I love that radical way of understanding the Christian faith around centering ourselves in love. It's essential. And I think we need these kind of radical forms of community to reach, because I think the way we do church now is so distant for so many people that we have to think quite radically about how we reconnect with ordinary people where they are.
It's a contextual piece, isn't it? Like, contextual mission, where church and culture meet.
Absolutely. So, that's what I love about Jesus. Where if you look through the New Testament, he munched his way through the entire New Testament, talking to all sorts of person he shouldn't be. I love that. And something about this kind of fresh expressions, and I think new monasticism is a particular way of being a fresh expression, is about radically trying to be on that edge where church and culture meet, following the example of Jesus, looking at examples, practicing hospitality, celebration and joy, but also being there in times of great grief and difficulty, and a path of Christianity that I think is opening up this path of the contemplative path, which for me, it's been really transformative. I began this journey as a radical atheist at the age of 19, and it was a very early, fresh expression of church and the Taizé community in France that helped me to shift from being pretty anti-Christian to becoming one of them.
Interesting.
Mm.
Wow, that's neat.
Mm.
Well, this kind of leads into something we were talking about earlier before we came on Pew and Beyond today, but you had mentioned to us about opening up prayer as a missional strategy. Could you say more about that?
Yes. So one of the things that's really excited about our post-secular context is that many people realize there's something wrong. You know, a world that can't respond to global warming, where we're seeing such problems between the disparity between the rich and poor. So there's a real sense that something is wrong. So I think generally in a post-secular context, I think just to say we've moved from modernism to postmodernism to post-secularism, that people are desperately searching for meaning, and they're doing it through consumptive questing for spirituality. So I find it fascinating that we think that prayer is only for people who have faith or have an established relationship with God. What I find really exciting is about how many spiritual, not religious people, for example, are using Ignatian, Franciscan, and Benedictine forms of spirituality and prayer to explore the significance. And I'm super excited that they then become the media or medium for people to encounter the living God. So it might be a very long journey, and people have got all sorts of questions and negative stereotypes about the church, but prayer suddenly seems to be an asset where, you know, so we run a silent meditation group for stressed out, busy people here in the city, and all sorts of people who are not yet Christian have turned up at that in the past. So prayer and contemplation then become a medium. It's about trying to open up Christian spirituality to those who come from a secular, post-secular spiritual questing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So go ahead. Yeah, it's
No,
like
you go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's the missional edge, kind of the bridge.
And I love it. I mean, you know, mission, it can be quite hard, but if you just got to open up a room and be silent for 20 minutes and learn how to use a particular prayer practice like the John Main approach, which is an anchor word meditation, and that becomes a powerful, I love this idea about mission, about getting out of the way of God and allowing God to do what God will do. And therefore prayer and meditation and all these things suddenly become something that deeply resonate with contemporary culture. That is really exciting.
Mm. I like that. And you're not really talking about a short-term thing. You're talking about something that's deeply committed in the long term.
Yeah, I think fresh expressions, you can't, if you're intentionally trying to reach out to the unchurched, it takes a very long time, partly because there's such a negative stereotype of church and Christians. I remember my former job, you know, if I wore a dog collar, a clerical collar, people would spit. You know, there was such an antipathy towards the church and Christianity as something oppressive and fundamentalist. So I think it does take a very long time to build up relationships of integrity, to then allow people to feel safe, to engage with religious or spiritual questions, and that takes a long time. Whether you're doing a new monastic community or messy church or whatever, mission, if it's real mission, it is not a quick fix. It takes a long time.
And Linda says that she's seeing a rise in interest in this kind of monastic way as a way of life by more ordinary people. You've kind of been addressing that, but to what do you attribute the rise of this interest?
I think there's a combination of interest in ancient things. So, for example, I don't know if we had a real-time TV thing a while ago about the monastery or the Great Silence, where they literally had this kind of real-time TV program where they put 6 ordinary people into a monastery, one of them was into a convent, and millions of people turned up to watch that. So I think there's a real interest in this kind of weird thing, which people used to dress up in brown cloth and these kind of slightly weird religious communities, but there's a real interest in it and this kind of depth of Christian spirituality. It's not dissimilar to why literally thousands of young people go to the Taizé community in Burgundy every year, before this pandemic. So I think there's a resurgent interest in spirituality. And I think it's because a postmodern, post-secular culture is very similar to some sort of medievalism. It's almost like a neo-medievalism where all sorts of people are spiritually searching in a kind of pre-modern world, which is not about what you think, it's more about experience. So therefore, you think about how monasticism had a place in that kind of pre-modern world. So it's not surprising in a post-modern, post-secular world, there's a resurgence and interest in that sort of thing.
Yeah, and in something ancient, it's interesting, isn't it? Anchoring yourself in something ancient.
I think there's a lot of interest in ancient things. I think that's why lots of people really got into Celtic Christian spirituality, for example, because it's seen as pretty ancient, therefore it's pretty cool, or something that maybe resources something. I think it's because people have realized that in the modern period, where we were so tied into the Enlightenment and scientific rationalism, that we lost something as part of that journey. And so there's a hunger, I think, to go back to those resources that were kind of became minority sports through, where everything became about thinking and rationalism. I think there's a recovery with what Richard Rohr would call trans-rationalism, this return to the experiential, the thing that's transformative, that brings meaning, that isn't just about words and thinking. And prayer has a really important part of that.
Yeah, I've got a comment. Prayer is a missional strategy. Interesting idea.
Yeah.
How does that kind of working out in your context now? Like, tell us more about what you lived there.
So we've got, so we've literally trying to open up the daily office. Remember that we sometimes forget it, but the root of the Anglican Church comes from the inspiration of particularly Benedictine and Franciscan spirituality. So, the Book of Common Prayer was taken from monastic offices. So, we remember that the inspiration of the Reformation for some was about taking what was a very private monastery and that every local parish church being a public monastery that anybody could go to, where there was morning and evening prayer and daily Eucharists. I'm never sure that ever really happened, but that was the essence. So what we're trying to do that is exactly the same thing. So where we've got morning and evening prayer, we're trying to open up a more monastic office using some very ancient stuff, but also some very new. The importance of silence. We are obsessed with words in Anglicanism. I am sick to death of just words, and no space to encounter God. And silence, I think, is incredibly important for mission, because you have to be who you really are when you are silent. You can't run away when you're silent. So we have, on the surface of it, we've got prayer going on Monday to Thursday in a parish church. We've got online discussion groups, book reading groups, trying to unpack what this contemplative path is for those people, for people who are Christian and for those who are not. And I also run this kind of online spiritual, not religious discussion group for those right outside of Christianity in the church who want to explore things more fully. So in many ways, it's trying to dig deep with Anglicanism that meets the monastic tradition, that meets mission, and then just trying to be a little bit more spontaneous. And I think the really important thing is the relationality. And I think we've relied on come to us, attractional models of church. You do liturgy at people and then they go away again. We can't do that anymore. So it's a sense of how can we build up real relationships with people? How do we open up the prayer traditions of our churches? And how do we then make this a transformative experience, not doing things at people? So less programs. Let's get rid of those programs where we're trying to make people, let go of thinking people. We can't make Christians by making them think more. I think we make Christians by enabling them to experience the Lord and have transformative experiences of God. And we're not going to do that by endless training courses and by programs. What we need to get more bold about, I think, is trying to curate opportunities, which is what we're trying to do here locally, curate local opportunities for people to experience God. And that is what monastics have done for 2,000 years.
I love that, curating opportunities for people to encounter God. Yeah. There's some real peaceful kind of amening to you. I know Lynn says, oh man, this really resonates. Sick to death of words. There's some people going, yeah. And it's true, isn't it? We can just tack on some more words, fill the space. But sometimes the biggest risk is the risk of silence, that you might actually encounter God, that God might actually meet that.
And I think one thing I've realized is we're terrified of letting go of being in control. So it's almost like we're trying to arm wrestle God. And we fill all our time with words and programs, because fundamentally, I think it's because we're not trusting God. We have to let go of trying to dictate everything and trust God. So I think mission begins with letting go and trusting the Missio Dei, the Missio Trinitatis, for God and Trinity to speak to people on God's terms. So I think part of my realizing is doing less, allowing for more spontaneity, more spaciousness, more silence, more getting out of the way of God, then creates an opportunity. And it's amazing what happens when we shut up.
I could see where this would be a wonderful opportunity for folks who aren't ordained or don't have a degree or theological background, but could hold the space to create an opportunity for that silence, for that prayer. And maybe this is where our pioneer ministers might come in, or kind of innovative ministry leaders who might not have Rev in front of their name. Because I think sometimes we're still dealing with the priest has to do everything, and we're getting out of that clericalism model in many of our parishes. But this is a real opportunity that lay people who are passionate about prayer don't need to be experts, but can hold safe and sacred space.
Totally. And I think there's a journey to go on with contemplative prayer, and that's not an easy one, because it starts off, I think, with purgation, which can be very painful when we stop and we try to face who we are before God. That then takes to illumination, that takes to union, and that's that cycle. But I think I went on that journey because I got burnt out at one stage as a priest, and actually, in a way, I was quite glad I did, because that whole journey has made me a much deeper human being, a much more spiritual. And I actually, ironically, a more committed Christian as a result of that. So, and I don't think I think you're absolutely right. What we learn about all of this, and again from the early church, is that we need teams of people. We need groups of people to work together. You know, we remember in church history, the United Kingdom Ireland was evangelized in a year by small groups of monastics spreading the gospel through art, culture, prayer, music, storytelling. You know, that opened up the culture in a way, and that needs, you know, we don't need the over-clericalization of the church. Ironically, we remember that monasticism, you know, these desert mothers and fathers were really, really concerned about the over-clericalization of the church in the Roman Empire, and that continues to this day. You know, the idea that you can parachute an ordained person and suddenly it all gets sorted out. I mean, the culture is so complicated now that we need groups of people to be almost like the mitochondria that help those missional communities to make an impact in each locality.
Amen. I mean, there is still that emphasis. We know we just get the right priest to come in. They're going to attract the families. That'll be it. It's going to be great. And it's not working. It's not working, people. It's not going to work, you know. But we're getting some great comments here. Yeah, Janet Marshall, who says hello, by the way, says, amen, you can't program our way through. But they've been experiencing a resurgence in people wanting to the practice of saying the daily office, and have found that really transforming their churches and their people. Also, Astrid says that she's interested in how you can run a spiritual group, a discussion group or practice group, not necessarily Christian, but as a Christian.
So I think there's something about holding generous space, which is not manipulative. So we use an examine process for that spiritual, not religious discussion group. So there'll be a theme, and there will be silence, And then each individual there will say what they think about that subject for 5 minutes. Then people can ask clarification questions going round, and then there's some sort of open conversation. What's so important about that is you don't have too many Christians in the room, so otherwise it feels a bit power dynamic-y. So if you have one, maximum two, then that allows for a really healthy, open conversation. And if we trust God, going back to that thing of trust and control, then we have to believe that the Holy Spirit is unsettling truths for people to explore. And I think that I've experienced it as very, very powerful way of having an honest conversation where there's no power play. And I think that's what we have to remember with churches so often, so much power stuff going on there that sometimes all that gets in the way of people hearing the gospel. The beauty of doing these sort of spaces where we're just providing places of hospitality and dialogue, it allows God to do what God wants to do, despite all our agendas. And I love that, because God's much better at doing mission than I am. That's for sure. Yeah.
And it sounds like in those opportunities and spaces that we're not spoon feeding people doctrine. We're trusting the Spirit to, I mean, it's the Spirit's the one who gives faith. I can't give anyone faith, nor any of us. It's a gift of the Spirit. So trusting that, yeah. And that's pretty neat, because it doesn't have to be overly structured or a course or a beautiful liturgy per se. It can be kept pretty simple.
Yeah, so curation, I think, is this key skill there, you know. So I started off this before getting ordained as an occupational therapist, and that helped me to be able to be good at curating groups and leading groups. That is a really important skill for this sort of work. Curation is an art, holding, you know, how you hold things together, hold boundaries, give room for people to talk. How to do that generously and where there is some sense of calm is really critical. So I think that role of curation, missional curation, I think is really key to this type of work. And I love that idea. It comes from this kind of, I think the work is centered set idea of mission. So where the sense that God is this gravitational force that draws people to the heart of God. And so that, you know, that people have these kind of journeys of conversions of lots of little experiences. I'm trying to remember research that happened here. I think people said that they needed to have about 20 positive experiences of Christians to start taking it seriously. So there's something about this kind of, how are we playing our part in enabling people to have these little steps towards God? And often that is just about generous, giving space for people to explore and ask questions. One person once said to me, you never force feed a baby as you make them sick. You wait for a baby to cry before you feed them. And I think this is that same thing. We have to hold back a lot more and wait for people to be ready to ask those questions as they get unsettled by God as part of that journey to faith, which is very countercultural to the church. You know, you must do a course, you must understand the Nicene Creed, and then we'll confirm you, we'll baptize you. We have to people need to belong, I think, now to work out if they believe. And that is something we've not done until quite recently.
And I think, as you say, they need space. Like, people need to space to explore this, to encounter God. And it doesn't happen, you know, we kind of, you know, in our supper club that we have here, which is a form of dinner church, I think it's been really important that, you know, as you say, those of us who are maybe dyed in the wool Christians, we don't kind of come in there and wham our Bibles down on the table as soon as someone says something. You know what I mean? But actually, you know, you're willing to listen, willing to create, as you say, generous space, listening space. It's always a risk to listen, isn't it? You might not like what you hear, and yet that's where the richness really is.
Totally. But then you see, when those groups are happening, if I'm finding something difficult, and there's something about surrendering that to God and seeking God to do something in that moment, rather than I think what we often do is think that God is somehow absent and we have to speak for an absent God. Biggest mistake. You know, so there's something about how we be present to what God is actually doing. I think Graham Cray often talked about that in the early days of Fresh Expressions, isn't it? About prayer being about joining in with God, and mission being about catching up with what God is already doing. I think that's a beautiful phrase.
I love that
Catching
line.
up with what God is already doing. That's key to this.
So there's actually a real sense of almost optimism about the fact that God is actually active in the world and active amongst people, and maybe even active in our churches.
Yes, as long as we don't shut that down. I mean,
Yeah.
I spoke to someone 3 days ago who wasn't a Christian. I thought was really interesting because they said the Christians have got it wrong about. They said, yeah, the Christians are right to talk about God is a God of love. But what they said, I thought, wow. She said, the problem with most Christians are you have to be open to the practice of receiving that love of God, which requires an action on behalf of Christians. It doesn't just happen by osmosis. We have to be open to the reception of, and oh, yes, you're absolutely right. We don't do enough of that practice of the reception of. Sometimes we just don't immerse ourselves in the love of God, and we wonder why we end up feeling burnt out or that we feel under-resourced spiritually. And I think unless we practice the immersion in the love of God by a disposition of receiving that love, then it's hard to live the Christian life. And that was one big message I think I hear from the spiritual, not religious. They said, you Christians, you talk about Christian meditation and prayer, and we've been along to your churches. You never shut up. You're all talking. You never really focus on anything. You're all talking to yourselves, or prayer wars where you're trying to say something to the other side of the room through prayer, rather than anything to do with God. And I think they're right. So we have dumbed down on Christian spirituality in the church, and I think it's time that we recovered some serious discipline about going much deeper with Christian prayer and spirituality.
And so would you say that we undervalue that in traditional kind of church situations, and even take for granted that people know how to pray?
Yeah, one of my seminal moments was, so when I was a curate in a church, I'm not going to name the church, but so there was morning prayer, and there was a half an hour of silence before that morning prayer. And no one ever showed anybody what to do with that silence. So there was no way of learning prayer practices as part of that. They just assumed that people knew what to do with 30 minutes of silence. And I'm sure people were just thinking through their day and putting stuff in their diaries and various other things, because no, people don't know how to pray. And we need to really help people learn these incredible gifts. We've got 2,000 years of treasures in the church and these prayer traditions, and they are deeply underknown. So the Ignatian tradition coming out of the Jesuit movement, the Benedictine resources, the Franciscan resources, just to name those three, are huge and are largely not known, which is a big shame.
I remember when we were talking yesterday, get ready for today, you talked about being rooted in the Benedictine, the Franciscan, the Ignatian. So you're kind of pulling from a variety of streams in the church's history and tradition.
And it's not some newfangled thing that just was created. This is tried and true ancient practice. Sometimes I think when we take on something new in ministry, people just think, well, that's the new fad. This is not a fad. It's been around a while.
Yeah, this stuff goes back. I mean, there's nothing really new, I think, in the church. There's been, in the Western church, there's been 8 major epochs of crisis in the church. And it's very interesting, if you look at some of the work by Phyllis Tickle and other people like that, that it has been a form of the religious life or monasticism that's helped the church to recontextualize from one social epoch into another. And I think that's largely what we're talking about, a commitment to solid ways of praying, to trust that God is in this change, and to try and obedient to keep up with what God is doing. And I think that's why I think there's the religious life, monasticism, contemplative prayer, all that stuff is critical to putting down deep roots to be able to be resilient in difficult times. And I think we're going for one of those major epochs now, accelerated by this pandemic around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, we're in a moment where we really need to stop and say, where are we going? What is this telling us? Because it's such a powerful moment. Michelle says one of her friends who became a Christian as an adult said that one big problem was there was lots of teaching Christian beliefs, but no one teaching Christian practice. And Astrid wants to know if you could give her some examples of themes, like how would you cultivate spiritual discussion and practice in a group?
So I think it's asking the questions that people are slightly nervous to talk about. So death, that was one that they talked about, or I'm trying to think of love. Trying to think some of the other stuff coming out of the sense that things never stay the same. There's all sorts of themes. You know, I think it's really good to have existential questions. So it helps people to ask religion and engage with religious questions. You know, what is life for? You know, all those sort of questions. And what is love? What is community? All those sort of things really generate. And often I think one really good approach is that when you've had one conversation, normally it will raise some issue that will be which would be a wonderful title to use for the next one, which then gets deeply owned by the people who are there, because that's where that conversation ended. You know, sometimes it ends with another question. So yeah, I love all that sort of stuff. It's exciting. I find it so exciting. And the one thing I always remember from it, we're utterly shocked that that all Christians weren't fundamentalists. They were really surprised, and that was actually a contemplative tradition. There's actually something mystical in the Christian tradition, and in Anglicanism. Yeah, so I loved that in a sense that there is it. This is, have a look at this. So yeah, all good.
And where else do you get to ask those kinds of questions and discuss things where you might doesn't turn into politics or not a safe conversation? So.
And I think in the UK at the moment we are really divided. There's a sense of we haven't just had the pandemic, we've had all the politics of Brexit and everything like that, and I don't want to make any comments about that, but we in a culture that's deeply in pain with extremes of people who majorly disagree. I think we as church and Christians have a real responsibility to be the people of peace, to practice that sense of coming together and to explore the common good. So there's a real opportunity, but people don't trust the church because we always tend to manipulate people into our own use. And we have to let go of that in the trust that God will bring unity through us trying to be a loving presence into these things. We have to let go of control a lot more. I think one of the great problems, I completely understand why we've had to import business practice with ever increasing financial resources and management issues. I completely see the importance of that. But the danger is if we go too far with that managerialism, that we then corrupt the church from being able to be a movement of renewal. Yeah, so we need to manage our resources carefully managerially, but we must never end up like church's business in the world, because we will miss the ability to do this prophetic work.
Relinquishing control?
Yeah.
What does that look like? What does that look like?
Well, God's mission, not ours, is the start.
Right.
And the church is not ours. It's God's, and I think I worked on a mission project for a very, very, very long time. And I think in my head, unconsciously, I thought it was my own. And that was wrong. And I think really did prevent the project to really do what it was called to do. So we have to let go of all of that control. I've certainly had to let go of control, surrender, practice this sense of seeking to follow. I think I like to think of Christianity and being a Christian as being a follower of Jesus Christ. So as being a follower is about obedience to Jesus Christ, where everything that exists in the name of church is actually God's, not mine. So critical. So critical. So we have to let go of the ego and the egoic, which is the contemplative path, and discover that sense of the true self. Yeah, and that, Thomas Merton writes about that a lot. He's been one of my teachers of this path, about how do we find out who we really are and immerse ourselves in the love of God to be able to stay there in a culture that's so distorted by materialism and power and money and the rest. And it doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't lead to any sense of fulfillment. You know, along where I work here, you have the super rich who live right now by the river, and we have one of the highest suicide rates of that group of people in London, because money and materialism just leads to addiction and I think an unhappiness. So, you know, our culture is still, I think, appealing to that idol of materialism, where I think the spiritual path is about less is more, and the importance of people, relationships is far more important than having stuff.
The word trust has come up several times just in our conversation now, and Ian, I think it's we've kind of covered how, as church leaders, we have to trust God, that God is in this, and trusting prayer. And how do we, as we're working with folks who are curious and want to explore prayer practices, the Christian contemplation, that kind of thing, what are some best practices around getting them to trust us? Because a lot of institutional trust, and some of it's well-deserved. They don't trust the church. They think we have different motives, but also to leaning into perhaps moving beyond trusting people in the church, but opening the door to trusting God. Are there some ways that we can help folks with that? I know that's a huge question, but
I think it was St. Seraph, I think, of the Russian Orthodox Church, that said, when we find stillness, or we practice stillness, there will be 1,000 converts. So there's something about the fact that we need to live this quite deeply. So I think and that's why I think the monastic tradition is so an important one, or why Thésée has worked so well, is that there are people who are living this day in, day out, and people can see that. So I think there's something about how, you know, I think importantly, you're asking the question, how do we build up relationships of integrity with people? And I think it starts with us living this out really deeply. And we begin from that premise that if I am more centered and I've learned to accept and love myself, then I'm going to be much more able to love people. I'm much more able to let go of trying to control people or manipulate people. Often we do that when we're not in a great place. So I think there's something about that discipline of our own journey of faith to be deeply immersed in the love of God. I think there's an open-endedness that says that we need to trust God enough that there's an open-endedness about relationships. What you reminded me of is someone who came along to a meditation group that we ran, who came for, I don't know, it was like a very long time, right? And seemed not to move along that journey of faith. And I could have easily have said, look, you know, really get your act together. You really ought to think about Christianity, and you really should come along to this course, because of my own insecurity. And I felt God going, well, I think God was pretty firm with me, no, don't do that. And I remember to this day when that person came up to me and said, I'm really sorry to have to report to you that I've had a disorientating experience in Jesus Christ. You know, now I would have killed it. You know, if I had ever gone to her to challenge her, we would never have seen her again. But because I was able to let go of that really had an impact, in a sense of, I think people watch us as Christians and they look for us to be consistent to what we say. And unfortunately, I think, and there's that terrible phrase in the Church of England, Father knows best, you know, in the sense of say what they do, but don't do what I do. That terrible disconnection between practice and direction. I think we have to do both. We have to live what we say and trust God. I think if we learn to trust ourselves, I think that's the other big problem we haven't really talked about. Many of us carry very negative attitudes towards ourselves. And that's because I think we live in such a beautiful culture where everything's got to be beautiful on the outside. And you've got to have the perfect this, the perfect that. And many of us carry this sense of we're not quite good enough, with that kind of imposter syndrome. We have to get beyond that rubbish because it's deeply unhealthy. And I can't remember a statistic. There was an awful statistic recently that said that 80% of Christians basically don't like themselves. Well, that ain't going to help mission. You know, so if this is real, then it's got to be transformative of us to learn to accept ourselves and to love ourselves. And then I think by people experiencing us at peace that we are, healthy, we're living out this stuff quite deeply, then people become really interested this is curious. What is this person about? There is something tangibly I feel here. That's what people have said. Not that I've got to be perfect, not at all, but more about, that I'm trying to be committed to the path of living this. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Great.
Wonderful stuff. Oh my gosh, time is flying. So we're getting lots of responses from people. It's really great. Great stuff. Linda's got a little story. She said she has a group that for quite a while, there were 6 of us, 2 Anglicans, 1 United Church clergy person, and 3 that were uncomfortable even using the word God. I love that. And they met and listened to one another with curiosity about how they arrived. I love that. She says, we are an odd community, but powerfully bound by our mutual respect and our different views of the journey of each other. I like that. But what would you say now to the local church about all of this? What are, the churches around here? I'm on the West Island, Montreal. Lisa's in Nova Scotia. The people of Niagara. What does the local church take away from this?
Big question. And very easy for me to pontificate when this stuff is really difficult in practice. I think there's something about getting back to radical listening to context. The whole fresh expression journey begins with listening to God, listening in context. So that's not in the bubble of just listening to people who go to our churches, but let's get out there, walk around like Jesus did, walk around these areas, get to know the types of people, their concerns, their aspirations, all of that stuff. So maybe get out, I'm aware the pressure on clergy and churches is enormous, particularly at the moment. But one little thing I did was to make the decision once, I'm going to get out, I'm not just going to do administration all the time. I'm going to put people first and email and reports and various other things second. And I'm going to spend that time prayerfully walking around, expecting for spontaneous moments to happen as I do that, as I get to know people. And I think so, yeah, let's get out of our church buildings and get in our parishes, get to know them, seek where God is at work, where are the people of peace, where are the things that are happening, and where can we, with the resources, and I appreciate that's getting tighter and tighter and tighter, but within the human resources we have, how can we bring life to others? And how can we seek what God wants? Yeah. And I think the biggest, particularly for clergy at the moment, is, and I hear all the anxiety and all the angst, and lots of people are terrified about losing their jobs, and lots of people are overworking to try and prove their worthiness to diocese. I really get it. But ultimately, our happiness is going to be in God. So I would say now is a time for really letting go of trying to be God in our own context. Let's try and follow God in our context. Let's not crucify ourselves in this pandemic. Let's try to be obedient to what God is doing. And, miracles happen if we get back to trusting God. Someone said to me quite recently, Ian, when you feel anxiety, ultimately that's a sign of you not trusting God. And I think they're absolutely right. And I've got a bit anxious about things. And I realized, yes, when I'm feeling anxious, so local clergy, when you're feeling anxious, notice that's a barometer about where that trust in God is. And if you feel that, then now is a time for spiritual direction and for going to see, spending time in prayer. Sorry about that. That's a long answer.
Wow, fabulous.
That's a great answer. Yeah.
Inspiring. Which connects well with our session last week when we talked about prayer walks and prayer caravans around our communities and praying for and the listening. So that's a really good reminder, Ian, of watching and listening, smelling where God is at work. We have a bishop in this region who was out prayer walking and smelt dryer sheets like fabric softener and recognized there was an opportunity to offer free washing and drying of clothes for folks who who were marginalized and couldn't afford to pay for money at the laundromat. And he always used that as an example. I think that's great. It's that listening and where is God in our prayer, but also joining in where there might be opportunity. So great stuff.
We also talked a bit about, in the local church, building in silence, spaciousness and silence. Because I think you're right. I mean, all of us talk a lot, whether we're Anglicans or not. I mean, Anglicans, we just call it liturgy. If you go to a church that says they don't have a liturgy, they just fill it up with more talking. It's just not liturgical talking. But it's still talking.
Just not from a book.
That's right. They're just coming off the top of their head. But just finding those opportunities, taking that risk to, as you say, I like the word spaciousness and silence. I love that because it just feels like, oh, I'm creating space to breathe, to hear, to receive.
I'm really hoping that the church building that I have here becomes a greater resource for local people. Central London is losing a lot of its public spaces as everything gets in terms of the built environment. So here is a green space with a building, and I hunger for it to become something that is open and owned by those who live and work in this part of London. It's not that group of people and their building, but it becomes our building. So we have to think quite creatively how we make those sort of things happen.
The other community well.
Yeah.
Different living water, spiritual living water.
Yeah.
It's great.
Well, Ian, thank you so much. This has just been such a rich conversation. Just a reminder, so people have been asking about your books again. One of them, you co-authored the book Ancient Faith and Future Mission. Also God Unknown, and that's on Trinity, spirituality, and mission. And then you've also got a new monasticism handbook.
Excellent.
And then as well, so if people want to find out more about new monasticism training, where do they look? So if you look up my name on Facebook, you'll find it. I've got a Facebook page with all the training events on it. So you'll find it there or on Eventbrite. All of it's advertised through Eventbrite. Trying to think, there is on Facebook a New Monasticism International group. There's also a New Monasticism for those in the UK. There is a New Monasticism UK network as well. So there are quite a lot of resources on Facebook and on other places. And if you want to see what I'm up to, then I've got a blog page at ianmobsby.net. I think it is all one.
Yes, Ian, I'm going to write that into the thing.
Oh, I'm just doing that too. So.
Okay, well, are you doing it?
I can put it on yours. Yeah, that's great.
Sure, thanks. Well, this has just been lovely. Thank you so much, Ian. We hope we can talk again sometime.
Oh, and I'd love to see you in Montreal. I would love
Absolutely. Come to Montreal.
Yes, and we'll host you in Nova Scotia.
Oh, I'd love that too. Never been. So that'd be great.
On your way to Niagara. That'd be great. Well, thank you. And thank you to all our guests online for all your comments. I'm sorry, as always, we couldn't do justice to them all, but keep the conversation going. It's been wonderful to hear from you. And you, Ian, this has been Pew and Beyond. And we're continuing our prayer theme next week. We're having, we hope, Aaron White, who is head of 24/7 Prayer Canada. And that's going to be in conjunction for us here in Montreal. We're kind of co-opting the Thy Kingdom Come 10 days of prayer, and we're having 10 days of prayer for the renewal of our diocese. And so we're going to be focusing on maybe some spacious silence in the middle of all that. So I'm quite excited about that. So more information about that is available on Facebook and on our diocesan webpage, montreal.anglican.ca.
Thank you, Ian. Again, it was wonderful to have you with us. And we are continuing prayer, and we'll be posting more resources on our Facebook page for the Spiritual Formation for Discipleship Network. So visit us there throughout the week. There's all kinds of things going on there, and we'll be back next week. The next 2 weeks are on prayer. So really exciting times. I think there's a lot going on across Canada and our diocese around prayer, meditation, prayer practices, this prayer things, Thy Kingdom Come. There's something happening, and I think it feels like there's energy there. And so this has been really helpful today. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been great. I've enjoyed it.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you. And bye, everyone. See you next week.